Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters of the Free Russia Foundation with its founder, Natalia Arno, who is also the president of the Free Russia Foundation. You were exiled from Russia in 2012, so somebody who's intimately familiar with the opposition movement in Russia to someday free a great nation from both the tyranny of Sovietism but also of Putinism. Talk to us a little bit about the demonstrations we're seeing now. It's extraordinary. They're all across Russia at this point. And what does the crackdown we're seeing on Putin's part suggest about how secure he is in his power?
Well, yes, you're right. The protests are happening in Russia now, and especially the center of attention is now to Moscow, where last Saturday there were huge demonstrations of people. It was a peaceful protest for free and fair elections. People were very upset that many independent candidates were illegally disqualified from running for the Moscow City Council. And though this time the rally was unsanctioned and the authorities were sure that usually people just are afraid to participate in unsanctioned rallies, still there were like over 25,000 people participating, and the police was really brutal. The brutality was extraordinary, and 1,500 people were detained. Many are still incarcerated, including the leaders of the Russian pro-democracy movement, Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Milov, Ilya Yashin, Yulia Galyamina, Dmitry Gudkov, many others.
And Alexei was poisoned again,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's the assumption, because not only was he arrested, but hospitalized.
Yes, exactly. And his doctor, this long-term doctor, confirmed that, and his lawyer, they all said that he was poisoned with an unclear chemical substance. It's second time with him. 2 years ago, his eye was injured. But poisoning as a means of silencing Russian opposition is not a new method for the Kremlin. We know that, for example, Vladimir Kromurza, who is now our vice president of the Russia Foundation, he was poisoned twice. First time, the doctors gave only 5% chance for his survival, so it was a miracle that he survived. There were many other poisonings. We, of course, all remember about Skripal and many Litvinenko and so on.
What does the furiousness of Putin's response tell us about how secure he is in his power? I mean, does it mean that the democracy movement is gaining traction and he's concerned about it? What message do you take from the response from the government at this point?
Well, I definitely believe that the democracy movement is getting stronger, the grassroots movement is getting stronger. More and more people everywhere, like all over Russia, are just discontent with what's going on. And what we see, how the Kremlin can deal with all this protest, with outrage of people, is one is to give them some economic bribes. They cannot do it because of sanctions, but also with self-imposed sanctions, and just with the ineffectiveness of their policies. Also, they can increase the level of propaganda, which is actually very difficult to do because propaganda is already unprecedented. What can they do? They can stage another thing when Putin dives, for example, and instead of 2000 BC emperor, he picks up 3000 BC emperor. It's already very primitive and huge, and people don't believe it anymore. But what they still can do is increase the level of repressions, and that's what they are doing. The number of political prisoners is the biggest in Russia ever. We have at least 315 political prisoners, now even more with these recent protests. And also the terms, the sentences for those who are in prison, they are getting longer. And so just they try to sow fear in people.
But does it get worse before it gets better? I mean, if you were going to say how many years it's going to take to weaken this government, how many years would you say? I mean, do you think it's a 5-year project? Is it a 10-year project?
It's very difficult to give such predictions, of course, and especially in Russia, we know it can happen overnight. We all remember the so-called ratings for the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, and we remember what happened later. Nobody believed, no Western expert, for example, would believe that the Soviet Union will collapse and so fast and in such manner. So definitely we see the changes. They will happen. We see that this regime has its expiration date, and that more and more people are involved in this fight, and they want normal conditions for Russia.
What can Western governments do to help at this point to help accelerate Putin's demise and the rise of a free Russia?
Well, what we always say, and what all pro-democracy Russians always say, will take care of Putin ourselves. It's our job. But you please take care of your own houses, clean your own houses, stand on your own principles. It's not only that, for example, Kremlin's people are bringing all this illegal money to the West. It's all this huge army of Western bankers, lobbyists, PR people, and so on and so forth. And we recently released a report, Misrule of Law, how the Kremlin uses Western institutions to undermine the West. And ourselves, we were very shocked with the level and brazenness and scope and scale of the Kremlin's attack on the rule of law in the West, how the Kremlin uses all just open, official, legal Western avenues, Western mechanisms, but at the same time attacking the very core of Western societies, Western democracies, the rule of law, and they are doing it everywhere, and the level of influence is huge.
How do you counter that, though? Because if you look at it, Russia has been very, very clever, whether it's giving money to Marine Le Pen, energizing the right wing, right? It's not like the Kremlin. The Soviets actually were remarkably principled. That money would never have gone to a fascist party. In general, it would have gone to communist or socialist movements, for example. You find Russia helped the French right. You see Matteo Salvini has benefited from Russian financing, as we've seen evidence. There were Russian fingerprints in Brexit that the British government never knew how exactly to respond to. Russian efforts, as we heard from Director Mueller, still continuing in the United States at all levels on election meddling and societal meddling. And you find that in almost every one of these countries, it aligned with certain British interests to get out of the European Union, so Brits accepted that help from Russia. Just like in France, whether it's Gilets jaunes or the right, there's Putin support, but they have their own agendas, so it's helping them. Mm-hmm. In the United States, that's the same exact thing. My candidate won. How does the international community fight this if some of the leadership in each of these countries has been co-opted, in a sense, to not actually oppose Russia? I mean, most of the sanctions that are on Russia is for its invasion of Ukraine, not for its meddling.
Exactly. What we see is like the best strategy is divide and conquer, and what we see that the West is very, very divided, and also that the West looks at the Kremlin's attack in a very separate, divided way. Just see one Ukraine separately, U.S. meddling in U.S. elections separately, but it's all, again, it's a very big and coordinated and huge attack, overall attack on the West, on the civilization, on the values of the Western democracy. And this is what is important. The Kremlin, they're very good in the psychological warfare. This is what they're conducting, and it's very easy to create destabilization, to sow fear or doubts in people, and they know that, and they really don't care. They don't have an ideology, and they would choose anybody who could be potentially on their side. It can be, again, anybody who's against U.S., so any anti-American forces or any anti-EU forces, again, anybody. They don't care what flank this force belongs to.
But how does everybody fight that, right? I mean, if, for example, the United States hasn't done much on countering election meddling, for example, on the part of the Russians, because Republicans have even told me, we're concerned that if we actually buy into this, then our candidate is somehow undermined, and so we don't want to do that. At what point can you fight Moscow if Moscow knows that the most powerful nations that historically would fight it aren't really fighting it anymore?
Well, you need all the political will and all the, again, strong society, strong demand from society, strong demand from media, strong demand of everybody, all the players, and again, being understanding that it's a coordinated attack, so you should also respond in a coordinated manner. One of our authors recently wrote a report about Kremlin's meddling into European elections in 2017-2018, and he analyzed many countries. What he figured out is that there are three patterns for the Kremlin. One is when Kremlin really meddles the elections, like it was the case in France, in case in Germany, when they have their candidates and they support those candidates or parties, or two patterns when they don't interfere. One is when they don't have any capacity, when they just don't have people who could support them, not media is capability, not enough even people speaking that language, and why not to become that strong nation to oppose like Scandinavian countries and so on. Or the third way is probably the saddest one, is when they don't interfere, because they're absolutely fine with the situation in this country, like in Hungary or Italy. They don't have to interfere. Any candidate there is fine with the Kremlin. And so maybe looking at this not as only at election interference, but in a, again, bigger picture about Kremlin's influence operations, because this is what they're doing. They do influence like long-term and very gradually.
Do you think, I know that you've been studying KGB manuals from the past on psychological warfare. Would it help to have, for example, USAID back, U.S. Information Service? Would those kind of an information agency, would USAID, a couple of these other mechanisms actually make a meaningful difference at the end of the day, do you think?
Of course, it's always good to have all the information. As you say, if you are well informed, you are well equipped, you are well prepared to do, and you understand what is your opponent, what is what they are doing. And it's a very interesting project that we are helping to work to. Michael Weiss, he's a investigative journalist, U.S. Journalist, but he also was very engaged to our report on misrule of law. So they are now studying this KGB original manuals and all the strategies, how they were again recruiting agents or again promoting disinformation and things like that. And it's very interesting to see, because we see the same tactics, the same methods even now.
Let me ask you what happens after Putin. There's this sense that once Vladimir Putin is forced from office, for example, that the system will change. Whereas some people say, actually, it's a shark tank, and all of the sharks are basically still sharks. What happens after Putin? Do we go toward a more democratic future, or do we actually have to go through cycles of more bad and even potentially worse leaders until we emerge the other side as a democratic Russia?
It's the most critical question for us, pro-democracy Russians, wherever we are, inside Russia or in exile, and this is what we are thinking all the time. And for us, the most important thing is to have not Russia without Putin, but Russia without Putinism. And this is the most important time for us. It's time when we can do our homework and prepare for such changes, so that it's, again, Russia without Putinism. And like last year, we prepared a report on constitutional and economic reforms in the transitional period, what should be done, how Russia can go, like this roadmap to a free and open and democratic Russia. So this is what we are working on. But what we are trying to tell in the West, that again, we understand that there is a huge fatigue of all this news from Russia, that Kremlin is such a bad boy everywhere, and just we are tired, we don't want to do anything. And we are saying that it's not just like, if you compare it with a body, a human body, it's not like you have some bruise, or even maybe some understand that the problem is stronger and you have some, for example, tumor, but that it's actually a virus, that it's already inside of your system and it's already spreading its metastasis. It's very, very dangerous, and if not to address it, you'll die as a society, as a civilization. And what you do when you have a sick immune system, you try again to lead a healthy life, and this is what, again, the West should do. This is the best remedy against the Kremlin, just to stay on principles, to do everything in transparent and democratic way, but at the same time, again, to understand all the dangers from the regimes like Putin's regime.
Natalia Arno, the president and the founder of the Free Russia Foundation, thanks very much again for all your time. An exile, 2012, exiled from Russia. All the best to all of your friends who are now in captivity, from Alexei to everybody else. And I hope that they emerge safe, and eventually we all get to spend some time in a free Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.